Welcome, everyone. We have the great pleasure today of having Major General Rick Devereaux with us. My name is LJ Stanbrook. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council, and it's my pleasure to also welcome the Environmental Defense Fund, American Security Project, ECHO America, the World Affairs Council of Western North Carolina, World Affairs Council of Orange County, and the World Affairs Council of Central Florida, all our partners here today for this distinguished series, World Affairs Council virtual program. It is my pleasure also to introduce to you, well, let me start first telling you a little bit about the World Affairs Council. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we promote global understanding and education on international affairs. It is more important now than ever. We have a global pandemic, and everything that happens and anything that happens around the world seems to impact us here at home as well. Please do know that your microphone will be on mute and your camera will be turned off for the duration of the presentation. We will have a question and answer part here at this point, and if you are interested in having your question put forward, please look at the little app in the middle of the toolbar that says Q&A. It's in the middle of the Zoom toolbar. Click on it and please post your question. Do not post your question in the chat box if you can. This presentation will be recorded and we will send it out to you and to all our World Affairs Council members and supporters, and you are more than welcome to share this presentation with people that you think will be interested. And finally, if you do enjoy today's free program, knowing that at this point of time, the World Affairs Council needs to continue its important mission, but we don't have live programs and we don't have a lot of the things that raise revenues for the working of our nonprofit. If you feel that you can contribute to us, please do so. We would very much appreciate it. A dollar really helps at this point of time. Thank you for doing that. As I said, our program partners, EDF, ECHO America, American Security Project, World Affairs Council of Western North Carolina, World Affairs Council of Orange County, and World Affairs Council of Central Florida. Thank you all for being with us here today. It is my pleasure now to introduce to you, and I have to click the right button here to get out of the share screen so I can see that. Okay, here we are. I am trying to get to the document that I have to open. Holley Truax will introduce Major General Devereaux today. He serves as the EDF's Southeast Regional Director based in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he directs a 25-person office. Holley is responsible for expanding the influence, visibility, and effectiveness of EDF in North Carolina and across the Southeast region. To this end, he works to cultivate long-term relationships with key leaders from public, private, and nonprofit sectors in order to build a network of highly motivated and powerful individuals willing to advance EDF's climate-focused priorities at the state and federal levels. In North Carolina, Holley manages a permanent state-based team of staff and consultants who leverage their own influencer networks, spot salient issues, mobilize constituencies, craft and promote powerful communication strategies, and build new partnerships to form powerful pro-climate coalitions. Holley, we've worked together in the past, and we really appreciate your being a partner with us today here. So please go ahead, Holley Truax.
Thank you, LJ, for that very kind introduction. And thanks also to Jesse on the World Affairs Council team and to the whole American Security Project team for the opportunity to work together again to organize an event that is timely and relevant for us here in North Carolina. We at EDF really appreciate our longstanding partnership with the ASP and the World Affairs Council, and we've been looking forward to this event, even as we miss the opportunity to be with all of you in person. As LJ said, my name's Holley Truax. I'm the Southeast Regional Director for Environmental Defense Fund. EDF is a national organization with a global reach, and we're committed to finding practical solutions to the most pressing environmental problems of the day. Last year marked 30 years since EDF opened its North Carolina office. And as LJ mentioned, we've grown our team to 25 staff based in Raleigh, where we're focused on stopping climate pollution, accelerating the transition to clean energy resources, and enhancing the resilience of ecosystems and communities in the face of a changing climate. You know, from our earliest days as an organization, EDF has been driven by science, and an ever-growing body of scientific evidence shows that climate change represents, even in this era of COVID, the single greatest threat to natural systems and human communities that sustain life on our planet. As we'll learn during today's discussion, I hope, climate change is not some far-off problem. It's here right now, threatening communities across North Carolina, our nation, and the globe. At EDF, we're optimistic about our society's capacity to tackle this challenge. There is still time to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, both by changing human activities that contribute to the problem and by helping communities to prepare for the changes that we now know are inevitable. Yet, as a society, we're not focused on this challenge with the necessary level of urgency. For this reason, EDF is always looking for partners to help us make the case for climate action. And American Security Project has been a great ally in this regard. So it's a real privilege for me to have the opportunity today to introduce Major General Rick Devereaux of Asheville, who served for 34 years as a pilot and commander in the US Air Force. Now retired, he taps his extensive military experience to write, speak, and teach on a variety of topics from climate and security to technology and leadership. Major General Devereaux is a graduate of the US Air Force Academy and also received degrees from the Air Force Institute of Technology, the Air University, and the Naval War College. During his career, he logged more than 4,000 flight hours and commanded at several levels, including for a flying squadron and 2 military installations. He also served 2 tours on the Joint Staff of the Pentagon, among other distinguished posts. Following retirement from the Air Force, Major General Devereaux has consulted with defense firms, think tanks, and technology companies. He's a member of the American College of National Security Leaders and has served on the board of the National D-Day Memorial, the Blue Ridge Honor Flight, as well as Asheville Civil Service Board, and the advisory group for the Center for Climate and National Security. Wow. So please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Major General Devereaux.
Well, thank you very much, Holley. Thank you, LJ. Thank you, Charlotte World Affairs Council, for having me. I'm really indebted to the Environmental Defense Fund and the American Security Project and others for sponsoring this event today. And I mean, this is a topic that's important to me. It should be important to all Americans. And it's not your traditional national security topic. When we talk about climate change and pandemics, usually we're talking about things related to the environment and healthcare, but I'm going to try to bring those home to this national security audience today. You know, I got interested in this topic back when I was on active duty as the commander of the Air Force Expeditionary Center, which was a training and preparatory institution that got folks ready to deploy overseas. And it really struck me how dependent our Air Force and our military was on fuels. In order to deploy, in order to operate abroad, we had to either bring our own fossil fuels or procure those overseas, and it was a monumental task. And then later, my last assignment in the Air Force, I was involved with operational planning, as the director of operational planning for the Air Force at the Pentagon. And I started to note how much climate and changing climate was impacting our war plans and our contingencies. And so that's sort of carried me into retirement, and is where I got more interested in writing and speaking on this issue. Today, I want to briefly talk about the impact of climate change on national security And then I'm going to try to connect with the current pandemic that we're dealing with, and show some sort of parallels as well as where those two areas intersect. And then we'll get into your questions, because I'm really delighted that we have such a good turnout today, and I want to hear what's on your mind. So let me start, if I can do this correctly, with a little bit of a highlight of the American Security Project that I'm a part of. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit group. As you can see, consists of many retired ambassadors, general officers, and others. And American Security Project has been working on this topic of climate change and security since way back in 2006. They normally take their project on the road, but aren't able to do that right now. But we're most recently in Charlotte, I think back in May of 2018. So I don't want to so much get into the science of climate change, but just to tell you, and I think most of you agree with 97% of scientists that have published on this topic, that climate change is real. And that climate change there's a direct linkage between fossil fuel usage and the rapid rising that we've seen in temperatures across the planet. So I'm not going to debate that point today, and I hope you'll agree with me on that. Of course, there are lots of objections to this area of climate change, but they tend to be in the political front. And as we know, we live in a time when everything has been politicized, correct? Whether it's the food you eat or whether you're going to wear a mask in the midst of a pandemic seems to have a political spin to it. But when it comes to climate change, there's a lot of alternative explanations, I suppose, out there other than the carbon we're putting in the atmosphere. But most of those have been debunked and I would consider on the fringes of social media or the internet. And really talking about climate change and national security, I think brings people into the conversation that otherwise might be skeptical about the significance of climate change. And frankly, military commanders do not have the luxury of putting a political spin on this topic because, as we'll discuss, they're busy planning, reacting, and preparing for all of the implications of climate change on our national security. So it's a sobering topic, but let me lighten the mood by showing you this, the man on a desert island cartoon. I guess it doesn't quite work when global sea levels are rising, so we can't even use that cartoon anymore. Sorry about that. Okay, let me, all right, let me talk to you directly now. I hope this is all working. I want to talk to you about 5 particular areas in terms of why the military is interested in climate change. What the real focus of the planning activities are. And first off, in 2018, and Congress put in the National Defense Authorization Act language calling climate change a direct threat to our national security. And that kind of language has been pretty consistent across administrations. There's really 5 significant ways that climate change and fossil fuel usage, for that matter, impacts the military. The first area is what I'll call the direct mission impact. Due to climate change, we are seeing an increased number and increased significance of extreme weather events. And the military has to prepare to respond to those events, whether they be hurricanes, tsunamis, floods, droughts, famine, wildfires. the fact of the matter is our military is a 911 force, and they're called into action repeatedly to respond to these kinds of extreme weather events at home and overseas. When I was a commander of a operations group in California, one of our roles was to prepare teams that would deploy overseas with hours of notice and open up austere airfields that would allow Air Force airlift forces to bring in supplies and troops, whether it's to support some kind of contingency operation or a humanitarian response mission in response to a natural disaster. And that was often the case. It is kind of a side note, and I'm going to show you a picture here. I know many of you Charlotte types have been to Asheville, North Carolina, but you probably don't know that as you're driving down Patton Avenue to come into Asheville, if you look off to your left, you'll see the Federal Building. And that's the home of the Air Force's 14th Weather Squadron, which is co-located with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And the job of this Air Force unit is to conduct climate assessments for military units around the world to help them prepare for the climates that they're going to deploy into, to help commanders prepare for how climate change will impact a particular war plan or contingency operation. So this is not just a theoretical or conceptual notion. There's actually active duty military unit here in North Carolina whose job is to help understand and assess the impact of climate change on military operations. And the fact is that this slide is busy, but if you look and see the green dots on this slide, what you'll notice is the number of humanitarian assistance and consequence management missions that we've participated in since 1980. And although we think of the military as responding to and preparing for combat operations, it's really these extreme weather events that we've had to cope with repeatedly over the past several decades. And the numbers show that the trend line is going up dramatically in terms of whether it's wildfires, landslides, earthquakes, tsunamis, you name it. In 2019, was no exception. We had $40 billion worth of weather disasters globally, which tied with 2018 for the fourth highest inflation adjusted number of extreme weather events that resulted in property damage. So again, not a theoretical issue at all, but one that our military has to deal with, extreme weather events. Another area, or a second impact that the military is sort of focused on with respect to climate change is the impact on its bases here at home. DOD reported last year that 79 of its most critical facilities in the United States were vulnerable to climate change factors, whether that was sea level rise, floods, droughts, wildfires. We know that here in North Carolina, don't we? Camp Lejeune suffered $3.6 billion worth of damage from Hurricane Florence. Floods at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska and Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida caused over $6 billion in damage over the last few years. As a consultant, one of the things I do is periodically travel to bases that are concerned about reducing risk factors that might cause their installation to close or be downsized. And one of the factors that many communities have to deal with today is the impact of weather on their installation. I know some of you have seen pictures of the Tidewater area around Virginia. Let me just show you this here. This is the Hampton Roads, Virginia area known as the Tidewater. It's home to 29 military bases, and not just the Navy, but the Air Force, the Marines are present, the Army, and you can see the blue areas where there's projections of sea level rise that would not just affect these bases, but take out much of the local infrastructure. So this is an area that, you know, and it doesn't just affect Hampton Roads, but also, you know, places like Key West, Paris Island in South Carolina, and many, many coastal installations. Okay, another area that besides military bases is just the attention and focus of our military over the last decades. In fact, during virtually all of my career, was sort of addressing the reality that fossil fuel dependence is a big source of international tension and conflict. I don't have to recount for this audience the number of times we've deployed forces to the Mideast due to contingencies or operations that threatened our access to oil. And even as the US reduces its foreign dependence of oil, oil and natural gas are still a global commodity. And that means that shocks in the system abroad will affect our prices and our energy industry here at home. So the US has to pay attention to that. The Navy certainly does in watching strategic choke points like the Malaccan Straits off the coast of Singapore, or the Hormuz Straits that get 25 to 35% of the oil and gas tanker flow around the world. Many of you have probably been reading or hear about the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea that are estimated to have $2.5 trillion of hydrocarbon resources, which China has staked a claim on, much to the chagrin of their competitors in the Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries in the region. And that's why today we have a couple carrier strike groups that are cruising in those waters just to sort of maintain freedom of navigation, not just for the US, but for all the international commerce that flows through that area. I mean, if you add up the numbers, about 20% of our DoD budget is focused on ensuring access, international access to the sea lanes provided by the US Navy. And that equates to about 30 cents a gallon. What we pay at the pump is to help fund that protection of those assets. You know, another area that besides the focus of our forces is our ability to deploy and operate is at the same time fueled by fossil fuels in terms of fuel for our aircraft, ships, installations overseas, our bases, our vehicles. But that fuel is also a tremendous source of vulnerability because it's expensive. We have to bring it with us, or we have to ensure access to those logistics lines that provide the fuel. You know, during my time in the Air Force, one of the aircraft I flew was the C-5 Galaxy, the largest aircraft in our military. It burned about 4,000 gallons of fuel an hour, and it was air refuelable, and the cost of getting that fuel in the air and passing it via tanker is high. And it's not just for the aircraft and the ships and tanks and vehicles, but also for our expeditionary bases. Places like Afghanistan, as we planned for those operations, we had to count on about 2,000 kilowatt hours per person on the ground. In a place like Afghanistan, we estimate that it took 8 gallons of fuel to deliver 1 gallon to those deployed locations at a cost of about $400 a gallon. And it wasn't just the monetary cost, but the casualties that ensuring access to fuel was significant. About 1/3 of our casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan were in some way, shape, or form associated with guarding fuel convoys. About 1 out of 24 convoys in Afghanistan suffered casualties. So this sort of our fossil fuel hunger for our deployed operations doesn't just cost us treasure, but it costs us blood. And you know, that's one reason why General Mattis famously said back, I think when he was a major general, that we needed to figure out a way to unleash the Marine Corps from the tether of fuel. Finally, the last area that I think climate change is a worrisome area for military commanders is that climate change can be an accelerant of instability, or what we call a threat multiplier. In other words, climate change is not likely to directly cause a conflict, but it certainly can influence many of the underlying insecurities that cause a region of the world to become unstable, where states and their government structures become weakened, become failed states, which leads to potential conflict with stronger states. It leads to authoritarian takeovers. You know, and you look at examples, places like Syria, where the drought in Syria prior to the Arab Spring really is what caused the migration and the discontent in the urban areas of Syria, and that uprising directly led to a lot of the instability that we saw in Syria. And then it's not just looking in the past. You know, if you look at places like the Himalayas, the glacier retreat in the Hindu Kush area, and the impact on the downstream Indus River areas, you can see the potential for conflict with India, Pakistan, China, and other countries in that area. So let me, before I take some questions, I want to say just a few words about this sort of nexus between climate change and this COVID-19 pandemic that we're in. And there really is an intersection, I think. And that's one reason is that this changing climate that's all around us is also impacting the pattern of disease vectors. If you think about it, as climate changes, this drives migration patterns of people. It helps move people to urban areas where food, water, jobs are scarce. It puts people in closer proximity to previously undeveloped areas. And the virologists tell us that this sets up an equation called viral chatter, where there's people, animals, virus in close proximity to one another. So the prediction is that with climate change, we could see more pandemic events in the future. And as we know, all of this becomes connected. Pandemics lead to unemployment that we're experiencing now, hunger, stress, political upheaval, protests, healthcare scarcity, xenophobic tendencies, conflict, violence. So everything becomes connected, and the sort of recipe for a cascading crisis is there before us. And if you're interested in this topic, I would encourage you to take a look at last week's Economist. There was a great article there about the sort of how COVID-19 shows that with a pandemic, that the risk of conflict arises in many different forms. So take a look at that if you can. All right. What should we do about all this? That's the $6 million question. We know that pandemics have an impact on our national security, right? We're living that right now. And that shouldn't have been a surprise. In fact, besides Bill Gates and others, in January 2019, a little over a year ago, the Worldwide Threat Assessment that was prepared by the Director of National Intelligence predicted, "We assess," and this is a direct quote, "that the United States and the world will remain vulnerable to the next flu pandemic or large-scale outbreak of a contagious disease that could lead to massive rates of death and disability." You know, and besides the impact on our world and nation and on lives and economies, we know our military's been impacted too. I think I saw the count today. There's about 17,000 within the Department of Defense that have been infected, another 700 in the hospital or so. Our military is not a force that likes to stay in garrison. We've seen a big impact on training events, exercises, both joint exercises here in the United States and combined exercises abroad. Our training and accessions pipelines, or boot camp, as you call them, have been impacted. Got a few pictures here that I'll show you. You know, the Air Force has had to space out their recruits. They quarantine them for 2 weeks at the beginning of their training, and they've had to shorten the basic training courses. The other services have done similar kinds of things. The military also, as you know, has deployed healthcare forces in cities like New York City to help out there. In fact, I read this morning that the Air Force just finished testing a 23-patient module that can be put aboard a C-17 aircraft or a C-5 that's totally self-contained, over pressure, that can rapidly move patients, both civilians and military patients afflicted by the virus. We know, we know that there's other impacts of this pandemic on our military. I know many of you followed the incident involving the Teddy Roosevelt, the aircraft carrier, and the relief of command of Captain Crozier. And you know, I don't want to get into the sort of politics of that sort of incident, but just to say how an incident like this can really strike at the heart of the morale, confidence in the chain of command of the military, and create perceptions that the senior leadership is not taking care of its troops. And if you imagine these kinds of incidents occurring throughout the military, you start to see a real degradation in the morale and the effectiveness of the fighting force. So I don't want to take away time from you all. So what I'd like to do is kind of pause right there. I have some thoughts on what the Department of Defense and our government can be doing in response to climate change, in response to this pandemic that we're in, but I'll perhaps sneak those points into your questions, and we'll just leave it at that. So let me pause there and start getting to your questions and make this a little bit more of a discussion.
And thank you, General Rick Devereaux. Mike Holley here. I'm on the board of the World Affairs Council, and I'll be working with you in the audience to get as many questions answered as we can. I will say that it is a little confusing. So I'm Mike Holley. My last name is Holley. Holley Truax did the introduction today. That is his first name. This is more exposure than the Holley name has gotten since the Smoot-Hawley tariff, something both of our families have been trying to live down for about 100 years. So, and I probably shouldn't have reminded folks of that. But General Devereaux, first question comes from Jennifer Watson Roberts, who is the former mayor of the city of Charlotte. Her other claim to fame is that she was a high school classmate of your sister, Donna. And Jennifer is very actively involved in lots of environmental initiatives here in Charlotte and throughout the Southeast. And she'd like you to dive a little bit deeper into the dilemma that the military faces with the things that you've described and the reluctance sometimes of the civilian government to either recognize them or pay much attention to them. What other avenues are available to the military for trying to get this word out, other than, of course, the World Affairs Council sessions like you're doing today? And Peter Gisela also asked something comparable, which is what form of media do you and other military folks with messages tend to use? Twitter, whatever, Facebook? If you could comment on that a little bit as well, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, great question, Mayor. Thank you. Thanks for that question, because I wanted to say a few points in terms of, well, what is the military, and you can throw in the administration, doing with respect to some of these national security implications of climate change? And I'll tell you, military commanders, as I said at the outset, don't have the luxury of politicizing this. They've got to get busy planning and responding, and they are doing things. You know, one of the areas that there's a lot of activity is what I'll call building a climate resilient infrastructure. And that means preparation for our bases here in the United States, whether it's seawalls and elevated structures on coastal areas, or providing electrical power systems on the installation that are separate for the civilian power systems, because you know, the civilian power that we rely upon, that's cheap and available, although much of it is fossil fuel based and adding to the carbon in the atmosphere, it's not good for military planners because it becomes a single point of failure. So what we're seeing across the US is more solar fields, wind farms in some cases, some biofuel facilities to make those bases more self-sufficient with sustainable green, clean energy sources. And the same thing is happening at our expeditionary or deployed locations. And this is where a lot of the science is happening now. How can you package renewable energy sources in a way to move them forward to deployed locations so that our bases overseas or our forward operating bases are not reliant on foreign fuel sources, or don't have to, you know, pay the costs that I described, or lose casualties guarding fuel convoys to those bases. So a lot of work has been being done in that regard. In fact, last year, DoD spent about $1.6 billion in R&D work and testing work. The interesting thing, if I can get political for a minute in direct response to the mayor's question, is nowadays those kinds of activities are being described with terms like resilient, being more operationally effective, ensuring the capability of deployed forces to operate independently. During the previous administration, you said all those things, but you also added things like, and being good stewards of the environment, providing clean, green energy sources so that DoD could be part of the solution set with respect to climate change and not just part of the problem. Well, those descriptions have gone away because this administration isn't as interested in broadcasting those kinds of points. But the good news is the underlying work is still happening. I hope that answers the question. As far as what avenues, we used to get out the message, things like this, all the above, social media, op-ed pieces, speeches to concerned groups, both sides of the topic. I spend as much time talking to veterans groups that maybe in some cases are conservative leaning with respect to climate change significance. And by the end of my talks, I'm hoping I'm sort of changing hearts and minds.
Thank you, General Devereaux. And next question comes from Quanta Dawn Light. I'm not sure that's the formal name for the questioner, but Quanta Dawn Light would like to know what other implications are there to climate change that we're not paying much attention to, but could be equally as complicating and devastating as sea level rise. The questioner cites the melting of the ice sheets and the release of microbes that have been buried in those ice sheets for millions and billions of years. What other things are we missing in the climate change discussion that we should be paying attention to?
Well, there's a couple obvious ones that maybe we're not missing. It's being talked about more increasingly. One is the melting of the Arctic ice cap. In 2018, Arctic ice was about 25% lower level than the previous 30-year average. What that means is, besides the ecological impacts of that disruption in the Arctic, what we're seeing is an increased amount of commerce in that area. The sea passages that before were not passable, now you can get through. And there's a lot of undiscovered, untapped fossil fuel reserves in the Arctic. Anywhere from 15 to 30% of the world's undiscovered gas and oil reserves are in that area. And you can believe that Russia, China, and others are paying attention to that. And what's the implications for us? Well, it just means that our Navy, our Air Force, our Marines are paying more attention to that area in terms of deployments, patrolling, and monitoring. So there's an implication there. I think next to that obvious one, it's just look around the world at places where climate change is causing water access issues, where it's causing economic issues. All of that instability leads to what I'll call bad actors staking claims. And China and Russia in particular have not been shy about areas like Africa and Latin America, and particularly at a time when the US, whether you agree or disagree, has somewhat retreated, from the global stage. So nature abhors a vacuum. Climate change can be that accelerant that causes that cascading series of events that leads to instability and ultimately to conflict. So that's what I'm most nervous about.
Thank you, Rick, and thanks for that question from Quanta Dawn Light, who has written and said that is a real name. It sounded very strategic and kind of military, and so anyway, it's a wonderful name, and we thank you for that question. So Glenn Barham asked this question, and I think it relates to the fact that we are becoming more of a global community. And the question is the relationship that we have with China and how that will ultimately impact our efforts as a planet in dealing with these issues. And Glenn cites a proposed new development near in South Texas near Laughlin Air Force Base. It's going to be operated by a Chinese-owned company. And, you know, technology is pretty fluid. It moves all around the globe. And how do we factor in our relationship with China and the fact that technology is likely going to help us solve a lot of these issues?
That's a good question from an old friend. Thanks for that, Glenn. Yeah, China is a sort of key ingredient in this discussion. And, you know, let's face it, our relationship with China, even though it has been competitive, it's sort of evolving into adversarial relationship in recent years. And China has been active in pursuing strategies to help its economy, to keep its economy growing at the pace that its population has been used to, and that means they need access to resources and access to technology. So all of that sort of sets up the possibility for either cooperation or conflict. Take your pick. And unfortunately, the tensions and the adversarial nature of the relationship I think are pushing us more in a more stressful kind of period in terms of our relationship with China. You know, another thing is because the U.S. has stepped back from things like the Paris Climate Accords. And again, I'm not here to debate the pros and cons of that, but you could argue that with the U.S. out of that agreement, it leaves the door open for a new leader. And China, I think, has proven very opportunistic at looking for areas that the U.S. has retreated and stepping in, not necessarily in the interest of creating regional or global stability, but to advance its own interests. So I think we have to be careful when we think about policies that look at things like climate change in sort of independently in terms of our own economy or our own impact, because ultimately the global impacts will come back and affect us, especially when you look at countries like China and the role they're playing in the world right now.
Thank you. And next is from George Krelevec. And it's a question a lot of us think about and wonder about, and that is, how can the military be as effective as it historically has been without fossil fuels? What is that? What's the run rate? What's the ramp look like to get to a point where the military, to be effective, can wean itself off of fossil fuels?
Yeah, George, I'm glad you asked that question, because no one should trivialize the evolution that would be necessary for our military to move beyond fossil fuels. I mean, it's simply not possible to make that transition anytime soon for two reasons. One is our military, which is unique compared to most large militaries around the world, in that we're geared to not fight at home or defend our coastlines, but we're geared to project power anywhere in the globe. We want to fight our nation's wars abroad so that we keep our country secure. And that takes those expeditionary operations, those deployments to fuel those tanks, aircraft, ships. I mean, going green and coming up with sustainable sources of energy for that kind of those kinds of platforms just is not possible. So what we have to do is work around the margins where we can. Some of the things I talked about, when, you know, we may need fossil fuels for aircraft, but not necessarily for all of our vehicles at our deployed locations. We may need fossil fuels for our ships, but not necessarily do we need fuel for generators for our massive tent cities that we set up abroad. We can go to more renewable sources like solar arrays and wind power, biofuels, et cetera. And that's where the work is being done to try to figure out where we can parse sustainable, independent, off-grid sources of energy and use that as a complement to what we have to do with fossil fuels. And I'll say one other thing. I think a new technology that's really proving promising is hybrid electric motors. In other words, motors that power whether it's aircraft engines or ships engines that are electric, but the electricity comes from, say, a diesel generator, which allows you to use much less fuel, higher levels of efficiency, and gives you the possibility for transitioning that fuel to a non-fossil fuel source sometime in the future. So yeah, big task ahead, but the key, I think, is to keep making progress on it.
Thank you, General Devereaux. And I'll tell you what, let's do this. Let's maybe wrap up with two questions. One from Rebecca Burmester, who would like you to talk a little bit about plastics and the role that plastics play in both the problem and maybe the solution. And then another question that comes from a number of other folks in one form or another, Lawrence Bender, Chase Saunders, and me, which is, what is it about our species that requires a crisis in order for us to do anything? And I wondered if you could maybe comment a little bit about your military experience. Our sense is that the military lives in crises, and why it is that the old proverb about the frog in the pot, dropping a frog into a pot of boiling water creates one reaction. Having the frog in the pot and warming it up has an entirely different one. So plastics and the human race, to close it out.
All right. Boy, that's opposite ends of some kind of spectrum. When I think about plastics, I can't help but think about the film, what was it, The Graduate? When, plastics were the big thing. Plastics were the future. Well, I don't have much to say about plastics except in the military, just like the rest of our country, we're trying to wean ourselves off things that fill up landfills, and there's lots of initiatives within the Department of Defense to recycle and to try to be good stewards of our environment. So I'll leave it at that. As far as the second question on sort of the sort of innate challenge for humans to plan and react to crises, except for what we do in the moment. I frankly think this is a strength of our military. Whether you're a second lieutenant or a private in your first year in the military, one thing you learn very quickly is that the military abhors reacting to things. They like to have a plan on the shelf that can be implemented. And granted, any plan, as the saying goes, rarely survives first contact with the enemy, but a plan is a good starting spot. And I think this pandemic, my sense is this pandemic is waking up, not just military planners, to our country and world, that crises that we thought were too radical, too extreme, too remote to plan for, I'm hopeful that we're going to have a different attitude as humans when we realize those catastrophic but rare events are the kinds of events that we really need to prepare and plan for. And, the military and the Department of Defense, even though we're pretty good at planning, we prefer to plan for things like conventional armed conflict, or a plan to protect the Straits of Hormuz, or a plan to respond to Iran gaining nuclear weapons, or things like that. But I think this crisis has taught us that we have to do detailed planning and preparation for things like climate change, for things like a massive cyber attack against the United States, for all kinds of things that maybe we thought were remote, but catastrophic if they were to happen. So I'm hopeful that this will be a wake-up call for our country.
Well, on that encouraging note, we're going to turn it back over to Lubomir Stambuk to close it out. Lubomir?
Thank you so very much, Mike. Thank you for a great job doing the moderating of the question and answers. General, this was a real pleasure. We learned so much. We would like to invite you to come back when conditions allow to Charlotte and talk to us more. You're doing great work. And I would like to thank our partners for being here with us today. A special thank you to the board members of the World Affairs Council for your leadership and for enabling us and leading us in fulfilling our mission. With this conversation is adjourned. Thank you for participating, everyone. Take care. Be safe.
Thank you.